This is a good thing for American manufacturing. This is the Defiant 7 Talos, made in the USA, and it is the newest American-made manual folder with a Les George design. There's a lot to be very excited about this knife, and we're going to get into all of that. First, let's just get the specs out of the way. This is a $285 knife. It is made in basically the same shop as Les George's knives under his own name, or a very similar shop very close by. It shares some space with, I believe, Chad Nichols, people behind Nottingham Tactical Instruments, and a lot of OEM work gets done out of there. And you can tell these are very similar shops because if you look at these blades, this is George's Talos under his own name. This is the Defiant 7 Talos. I mean, the stonewash is a little bit different on this one, but these blades are just about indistinguishable. I would be hard-pressed to believe these blades were not made at the same factory, or at least at factories with a lot of people that are talking to each other. The difference is, while this Talos is a titanium frame lock, like most of Les George's knives, and runs north of $400, I think this retails for $450. And by the way, I will be reviewing this one, and it'll be a pretty positive review. This, in anodized black aluminum, is $285. So a little bit more than half the price of Les George's own knives. But you get the Talos design, which is one of Les George's classic custom designs, still made in the USA. And if you, like me, lived in a part of the country where you can't really carry automatics, this is a fully manual button lock, which also happens to be sort of the deployment method of the moment. It's a bit past its moment, but certainly people still love their button locks. Fast, fidgety, all that. 4.7 ounces, so still a relatively heavy knife, or at least not a light knife. 3.5 inches on this blade, and 150 thousandths on the blade stock. And this is now the cheapest way to get an authentic Talos design. Who is Defiant 7? So Defiant 7 is a team that includes Les George, I believe Chad Nichols is officially part of the team, and then a handful of other folks that come and go as designers. Frankly, if there is a small to mid-batch, even fixed blade or production folding knife design, production fixed blade or production folding knife design, I wouldn't be surprised if they end up doing a design with Defiant 7 at some point. They started putting together quite a roster of different designs. Now the thing is, most of Defiant 7's works, they're pretty much all, blades with a similar finish to this, and it looks like they're all black finished aluminum. Most of them are automatics. This is the only one so far that has been a manual button lock, which again, great for those of you who are like me in California or another jurisdiction where you can't really carry automatics. Defiant 7 is really trying to bring the kind of production quality that you're used to getting at that $400 mark, and getting knives that are made every bit just as well, with slightly different materials and maybe some intentional compromises on how the knife is built, that get it to a much more accessible price point. And so, one, they can sell more knives, which lets them create more jobs down there in Mississippi and just supports American manufacturing. But two, it just allows more people to get their hands on these exceptional designs without compromising on the parts of the fit and finish and production that really matters. And I think, and I'll go through this in detail across this knife, I think that's what makes this design really excited, even though you might just be excited to get a Talos in your hand at a price point that is under $300. So we're going to start with this blade now that we got that background out of the way. And this blade is every bit as good as Les George's blades typically are. So Les George's blades, I'll bring the Talos back out here. If you've had a VECP, if you've had a Talos, or if you've been fortunate enough to have one of Les George's fantastic fixed blades, you'll know that Les George is up there in the same echelon as guys like John Gray, as guys like John Demko. With guys that can take a blade that has relatively thick stock, 150 thousandths on both these blades, the Defiant 7 one we're talking about here and the Talos. That is not thin stock. That's thicker than the PM2. That's not as thick as a Hinderer, but it's getting up there. But whoever makes his blades, puts these super aggressive flat grinds on them. So, it is technically a saber grind, but it's a pretty high saber grind. There's lots of space to drop. But most importantly, this is an aggressive flat grind with a very nice stone watch on it. So there's no catching, there's no friction on this blade as you pass it through material. But because this thing is so aggressively ground, and again, if you had a VCP, if you had a Talos, you've experienced this. It's the case with all blades that Les George puts his name to as a manufacturer or as part of the team. He gets them so damn thin behind the edge, given their blade stock, that they just cut better than most other knives that are as thick as they are at the spine. And part of how he does that really well and keeps that thinness all the way out is, even though, this is a pretty typical slight drop point, I guess you could call it a bit of a clip point, because, that's why it just kind of functions as a clip here, with some nice jimping across the back. The blade shape is nothing unusual. This is a very typical blade shape. Your belly goes about half the way back. You got a nice flat back here. It's a very typical do-everything blade shape. But you got that great grind. You've also got a fantastic distal taper toward the tip, where, the swedge starts basically cutting away thickness at the spine right here. And this whole blade starts thinning from right about here. And by the time you get to the tip, you're talking a very thin, pointy tip. If I compare it to something like a PM2, you got that same aggressive distal taper toward the tip. That's part of the reason the PM2 cuts so well despite having relatively thick blade stock. And the exact same thing is true here with the Defiant 7 Talos. And so, because this blade grind is so good, you get the holy grail, especially in MagnaCut. You get the holy grail of a knife that is very tough. This thing is thick enough that you do not have to worry about doing stupid stuff with your knife. You can pry with it, you can scrape with it, you can do all that dumb stuff you shouldn't really do with your knife. And by the way, a button lock in aluminum housings, that's tough enough for anything that you need, as long as you're not prying open car doors with your knife. In which case, just go get a Strider or whatever. But for anything we need to use it for, this knife is more than tough enough, but you still get good cutting performance. And I will sort of get to one of my punchlines, which is the most exciting thing about this Defiant 7 Talos, is it is the new cheapest way to get your hands on one of these amazing Les George blades. I have long argued and long felt that Les George's blades, with the possible exception, sorry about that. Let's get the camera back over there. With the possible exception of Chris Reeve, just because I really, really love Chris Reeve's grinds, but with the possible exception of only Chris Reeve, if you want big, thick blades, the Les George's work is just about without parallel. It's certainly in the tippy top of mid to high, I say mid-scale production, made in America knives. He just grinds them better than most, and he just gets cutting edges that are a lot better than a lot of other manufacturers. When you go from, I just talked about how good Spyderco is here, but when you go to, either some of Spyderco's knives that aren't ground as well, or you go from somebody like Benchmade, or you go from somebody like ProTech, you go from a company that doesn't grind their knives as aggressively as somebody like Les George does, and then you switch over to a Les George knife, and you will be blown away at how well this blade cuts, given how thick it is at the spine. Now, it's still not going to be a super slicer, and still, as you do longer cuts that drag through material, it's still 150,000 stock at the spine. And the physics of that is still going to get in your way. It's also not going to be the sharpest knife in your collection. It's going to be very sharp for a knife with 150,000 stock at the spine. It's still not going to be, sharper than your Spyderco Centofonte or something like that. It's not going to be sharper than your TRM Atom, but it is going to be shockingly sharp given how thick and robust this knife is. And that's very, very cool, especially when you've got, companies like, ProTech, not a bad company, but they don't grind their blades that well. ZT doesn't grind their blades that well. Hinderer does not grind their blades well at all. It's very cool when you see a company that is really committed to making thicker stock blades that can cut. Demco is these days very much up there as well. So there's another extraordinarily good option on the market. But Les George has been doing those kinds of grinds even longer than Demco has, at least at a production scale. To bring it all back to where I started, the coolest thing about this blade, about this whole package, is that for $285, you can get one of these extraordinarily good Les George blades in your pocket. And it is just a really good blade. If you want a hard use, heavy duty blade, it's going to do everything you want. It's going to do it all very, very well. And it's going to do most of it better than you expect it to. Jimping on the back, very nice. Blade finishing, very, very nice. Again, the one thing that's sort of a noticeable difference, the stonewash on the Talos is a little bit nicer. Probably went for a couple more passes through that stonewasher than it is on the Defiant 7. But honestly, you wouldn't notice that if they weren't right next to each other like this. Get that out of the way. Really nice blade finishing. Very nice crisp swedge, nicely knocked down. Excellent thumb stud here. This is, as far as I can tell, a custom Les George designed thumb stud, meaning, he designed this himself. I haven't seen anybody else use it. It catches your thumb very nicely on one of these shoulders and is nicely placed. It just snaps out. And by the way, I don't think I finished saying it at the start. Maybe I did, but this Talos design is very well proven. This has been a custom that Les George made for a very long time while he was still making customs regularly. So this is a classic design brought quite authentically into a modern production format. So all the little things like that thumb stud placement are going to be great. Similarly, handle ergonomics are very solid. This is a big, chunky, and very old school handle. If you look across the back here, you can see there's quite heavy contouring on these aluminum scales. A lot of rounding, especially toward that edge. There's kind of a rounded lip right as you get toward that edge. A little bit of chalkiness, which is intentional from the hard coat anodized aluminum. You do see it will, chink off as it hits other metal things in your pocket. I find that looks very cool. Some people will hate it. Nice knurling on the button here, which is a very cool detail. But anyway, going back to your handle here, it's a handle that is doing most of its ergonomic work simply by being relatively big, relatively thick, and relatively rounded. If I bring our PM2 back out here, you can see it is, a good bit thicker than your PM2, and it's this big, rounded, contoured handle. This thing will fill your hand. You grab it here. It is a full handful of knife, even at a 3.5-inch blade. This carries, and the handle holds like an even larger knife. And this is a bit of a callback to the older days of knife design where handles were just bigger. Handles had, some more neutral lines and some of these big, curvy lines and things like that. It's a very simple design. It is doing most of that work just by being big and rounded, but that doesn't mean that it's not comfortable. It also is ergonomic for what it is, in the sense that, you got this big front finger index here, you got a nice belly, you got some decent jimping. That does give you some grip, but is mostly for indexing toward the back. It rolls into the hand pretty nicely. I will say, I normally like flats at the top and bottom of a knife. With this much rounding, these flats actually do end up feeling a little bit sharp when I really do start to push on this knife. I have noticed that the flats at the bottom in particular can get a little uncomfortable. They can start to dig in a way that is unpleasant, not ergonomically helpful. And that is a realistic, concern given this is meant to be sort of a big, tough knife. So your mileage may vary on whether you have that same experience. I will say it's not an ergonomic dream for me. I tend to prefer knives that do more of their ergonomics, like the Manix, with, curves, scallops, things like that really do lock your hand into place, not just being a big old broomstick to hold. But for people with larger hands, it's going to feel great in your hand. And for people that do just like those bigger, rounder, more contoured handle, it's great. That's also the biggest difference from in the hand and in the feel from this Les George Talos, which has flat scales with those same huge rounded chamfers on the side. And this comes off as more rounded on the top and bottom, but flatter and a little bit thinner and sleeker overall. I do prefer the ergonomics on this version, though it's also quite a bit heavier because it's all titanium. So all of that to say, it's a big, it feels like a big knife, but it's a big, comfortable knife. You're not going to see any major ergonomic issues, though I do think if you really want to use this hard, it's not going to be the most comfortable hard use knife you've ever handled, which is a little bit disappointing given sort of the history of the Talos and its history as kind of a relatively well-known, very pretty knife at times, the way the Les George did him up, but a knife that was meant to be used hard. The button lock here is very well done. I love putting knurling on the button. It looks cool. It stands out from the handle very nicely. It also gives you a little grip, and it gives you a little bit of indexing. So when you're running your thumb over this handle, you can feel exactly when you get to the button. Depress the button, and it works like a button lock. It drops right shut because there is nothing against this blade, and it just swings. That's one of the benefits of a button lock. And then there is a little bit of play. I bet you if I tighten this pivot, I could get rid of that play. Play is obviously quite common in button locks, at least a little bit of play. It's not universal. There are plenty of button locks without play. And again, when I got this, it had no play. I bet you if I tighten the pivot a bit, I could probably get rid of that play without sacrificing action. On the opening side, you get a slightly stiffer detent with this one than you tend to get with button locks. One of the criticisms of a lot of button locks is the detents can be a little mushy, a little non-committal. This here, you've got a pretty decent stiff detent, and when you break it, that thing is going to fly out. Now, balance-wise, it's a pretty neutral handle, because even though this is aluminum, it's a thick piece of aluminum with no internal milling, so this becomes relatively heavy for an aluminum handle. And though this blade does have a lot of stock and a lot of thickness, it ends up balancing pretty neutral, so it doesn't feel either blade heavy or handle heavy in use and in the hand, which again, just sort of underscores this is meant to be a knife to do just general knifey things, maybe on the harder use end of things feel of this knife. It's not really designed to be extraordinarily good at any particular thing. It's meant to just be a good knife that looks like a knife, feels like a knife, looks like a fairly attractive knife, but is just good. Fit and finish overall from this Defiant 7 factory, we already talked about the blade. The finishing on this aluminum handle is very nice. We already talked about the ergonomics, but you've got nice chamfers here. The hard coat aluminum is done very nicely. Again, very nice contouring. You can see the machine marks a little bit, but it's all competently done. You've got this sort of function of jimping across the back, closed back design. Pretty basic clip here. All the hardware sits very nice and flush. That's something that Les George does very well in his designs. The hardware always integrates very, very well with the rest of the handle. It's not complicated. It's not elaborate, another little chamfer toward the butt, but everything works well and centered well. Les George always does a very good job centering his blades as well. So again, it's kind of a recurring theme with this knife. Very, very good fit and finish. Not trying to do anything special, not trying to do anything exceptional, but certainly when you look at $285, getting a contoured aluminum handle and a button lock, and this level of finishing and the grind on this blade and getting that all made in the USA for $285, to me, that is a very compelling value proposition. And I think that's sort of my overall review summary on this knife. Take the price out of the equation, and this is just a very good knife. There is nothing bad about this knife. Do I wish it was a little lighter? Yes. Do I wish it was a little more ergonomically aggressive? Yes. Would I personally prefer if the blade stock was a bit thinner? Sure, but that's very much a matter of personal preference. But there's no part of this knife that is executed poorly, and all of it is executed very, very well. And so this is a very good knife, and honestly, before knowing about Defiant 7, if you had put this knife on a table and asked me to say what the price of it would have been, and told me it was made in the USA, and you told me that, it came out of basically the same factory that made the Talos. So again, I got really the thing I care about the most, which is that extraordinarily good blade. I would have said that this knife was going to be $350, somewhere around that. For this to come in at $285 is extremely competitive and really does demonstrate by this team a commitment to making very high-end, very high-quality American manufacturing and really good American knives with really top-end blade grinds, accessible to a lot more people. And that's really cool. That's also the most interesting thing about this knife. This is a way to get Les George's work and some of the best of Les George's work, not in a way where he's done a design for somebody else, because he's done plenty of those. But anytime that there's a designer collaboration with a big production house, there are compromises. That's just a necessary fact of it when you've got that many heads in there. This is a Les George design by a Les George company that is accessible and easy to get your hands on, and it's only going to cost you $285. And it happens to be in a very, very useful format in one of his classic designs. To me, that is a win all around. Personally, this is not my favorite knife. There are a lot of things about this that just aren't my taste. And if I'm going to go big and heavy, I'm going to personally tend to go bigger and heavier, like the Talos here. But that's more a reflection of my personal taste. For most people that value quality, value made in the USA, and want something that is just a little bit better. Kind of like how people used to think about Benchmade, where it was like, I want an American knife and I want something that's just a couple steps better than what I'm going to get, from, my random knife company, or something that's a little bit better than what I'm getting from WE or, things like that. And I want it made in the USA to boot. This, to me, very much fits into that mold in 2025. This is a really auspicious start for Defiant 7 knives. It's a really good knife. It's a really recommendable knife. It is very much like one of those things where if I'm trying to recommend somebody the PM2 and they're like, hey, I like everything that you're saying about the PM2, but I think it's ugly as sin, and I don't like the Spidey hole, and I don't like the compression lock. Do you have something else that kind of feels like the PM2? And I kind of want metal on the handle, like I just want something that feels a little more burly. Yeah, this Defiant 7 Talos is a really good substitute that does a lot of the same things in similar ways. I personally prefer the PM2, but again, that's me personally. This is a really good knife. It's really well positioned in the market, and it makes me really interested in seeing what Defiant 7 has coming down the tubes. And I do hope what they have is more manual button locks coming down, not just a bunch of automatics. And I'm saying that entirely personally, just because I cannot carry automatics. This is a great knife. This is a highly recommendable knife. And if you've had any thoughts about, if you've seen these sort of, bouncing around and you've wondered whether you should try one, if you have any interest in button locks at all, I would say that you seriously should. I would also say, if you're a fan of Les George's work in the past, and you're wondering how this stacks up, I would say it stacks up just as you would expect a Les George design would. And most importantly, the most important part of it is really in here with very little dilution. And that is very cool and very impressive. So that's my review of the Defiant 7 Talos. Hope you found that a good use of your time. Hope it entertained you, and I will see you on the next one.